now. And go ahead, Dorothy.
Okay. I also want to mention that when we are in person, we are usually at the Lauren Greeno House in Jamaica Plain, which is a historic estate that is owned and maintained by the Tuesday Club of Jamaica Plain. And we thank them for allowing us to be there for many, many, many years. And we're hoping to be back there sometime in the future. So we, Chapter and Verse always buys the authors books for the library. We have a special collection in the Jamaica Plain branch of the Boston Public Library. And we really urge everyone here to buy books. You can find information in the publicity emails that you receive on our website. Susanna is posting information in the chat, and I invite the authors to, if they wish to express a preference for how they would like you to buy their book. So our first reader tonight will be David Miller, who is one of the people who helps us run Chapter and Verse. David Miller's poetry collection, Bend in the Stair, was published by Lily Poetry Review Books in 2021. Sprawled Asleep was published by Nix's Mate Books in 2019. Poems have recently appeared in Meet for Tea, The Poetry Porch, Muddy River Poetry Review, Boston Literary Magazine, and many others. He's a member of the Jamaica Pond Poets, as I said. His poem, Add One Father to Earth, was awarded an honorable mention by Robert Pinsky for the New England Poetry Club's 2019 Samuel Washington Allen Prize competition. By his recent book, people can either go to, well, this is in the publicity email, and you can look at that, or you can look at the chat, or David will tell you. David.
Thank you, Dorothy. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm really very gratified to be with you all this evening. I'm going to read 5 poems from the book, Bend in the Stair. And the first one I'll read actually is quite Jamaica Plain specific. It has to do with, or it comes from research I did a number of years ago in Boston City Records about the very house we live in here in Jamaica Plain near Stony Brook Station. So this is titled, From a House. I come from a house built within whiff of breweries now corked, set at the crotch of a valley whose brook now runs within tubes. House laughing with tailors, machinists, and trainmen, brooding with knitters, waiters, furniture movers, birthday full of chauffeurs and ironworkers, vacated by painters, insurance clerks, stagehands. I come from a house traded and kept by Doyle, Ryan, Daly, multiple Murphys, by and by Zuber and Zwerdling, doorbelled with Jaime, Rosado, Vasily, rent fretted by Baez, Kirakaos, Van Looy, trudged home and paced overhead by Dugan, Rodriguez, Solcida, where homecomers shook off their days of National Shaman, Somerset Hotel, Frank's Lunch, Chimes, brownies, wafted their dinners or scooped them from cans. I come from a house where I came to my she out of thin air, my karate heroine, siren of newspaper personals. I come from a house of quadruple mortgages when flappers verged on breadlines, a house whose glass-eyed Downy Flake donuts, house shield distilled spirits, Roxbury mattress, a pox after that of emptying lots. I come from a house bought out from under city condemning, its price nailed to the porch, upper third hollowed of walls and plumbing. A house with decades of martial art foot landings, massaged hard into blonde polish, that held itself free from sparks from the torched mattress, nay, stringed instrument factory. The lot's palimpsest soil turned up tubes of catgut. I come from a house with bedroom carpeted floor to ceiling, a flipped shower where cold is code word for Hot, a house where four now go out and come back with a homebody mouse. Surprised in the kitchen, it dives down a burner. A house rooted on thickness of pudding stone. A house that shares the water of earth in its basement. A house that stirs in its sleep with the passage of night trains. So in the book, at a couple points in the book, there are sort of implied seasonal passages, poems that refer to, sometimes obliquely, to the passage of seasons. So I will read the two poems that I've set up as basically autumnal poems. This nectar. My hand's shadow floats across the table, projected from a cloud-covered tapestry, freehand in grays and whites, light extended from our nearest star. Our city window almost fully green with conflagrations at the edges. Flame flowers saturate the eye, hold briefly still before the trees drop their bunting, turn again to rest. Chill spills from my fingertips. Here steeps tea from Sri Lanka. It is beautiful, Sri Lanka. Breath at teeth hushes, then melts amber across the tongue. My cold body makes this nectar happen. The interior kindles against the skin's anxiety, its fear to meet the air without protection, without a tender carapace of flannel, wool, or down. The introvert I comes forward with attention still more full as the mercury contracts, turns shy. We're all late October. And the next one, autumnal poem. My late father-in-law's new project, in memory of Joseph Norris Wiley, 1919 to 2012. In his hospice room, Joe took an exit alone. But our electrical engineer, relentless inventor, never lacks a fresh direction, even now in a place beyond language. He rewires the forest, though we can't unearth the apparatus. It's all his workshop, like that stream you hear. Wait, isn't that sound a little too much elsewhere? The same impending babble augmented to widen the radius of hikers' delight. We'll never guess his algorithm for autumn. Each leaf fully chromatic, not one dull, not remnant green aftertime, but the circuits can't be found, the data desirably obscure. These woods, still his workbenches, his inventor's broad basement. He experiments with new barks, shuffles fungal forms, scraps the dead ends, redrafts, and gets out of the way. I have a quite common name, and even with the inclusion of my middle initial, which I only use for writing purposes, it's still a pretty common name. So sometime back I decided, well, all right, let's do a vanity Google on David P. Miller and see what turns up, and there's a lot of them, and many of them have already died. So in that regard, everything in the following poem comes one way or another from that search. Autoparallel obit. David P. Miller was born in Cleveland, Ohio on June 21, 1919. He was the son of Bright Army and Lake of Bitterness. He marched for general contracting and taught in the public schools of Vine Capacity and Twig Portion. United in marriage to Brave Toy Bear, he wrote 2,000 umpire decisions. He passed away on August 26, 1907, aged 75 and 76, Pennsylvania Volunteers, 107th Regiment. The attitudes and philosophy of David P. Miller were girdled by the acronym ENCOURAGE, extension, nosebreak, carpentry, orphism, undertow, remission, avidity, gloss, enervation. Although not religious, he is outlasted by children Crooked Nose, Warrior Elf, and One Who Tans Hides, a grandchild, ewe herder, and eons of myriads. What was your experience working with David P. Miller? He was issued in San Jose on October 1, 1946, to the amusement of his family. He relinquished over 22 gallons of blood. He trickled down from Mayflower passengers. He moldered, renowned for his whistling, near Bell Valley at the age of 52. He divulged his belief in a force for good. Dew of the sea, dark river, holder of the heel, Florida convicted felon, grand theft firearm, best known for fast, cheap, and out of control, and blast off girls, attained the rank of Eagle Scout. Would you recommend David P. Miller to others? David P. Miller does not take on summer interns. He died Tuesday, December 20, 2011, after an extended illness. Do not send requests to be a summer intern. He will not take new graduate students until 2021 or 2022. Want a quote from David P. Miller? Assume the special values that named the fiber of his game, encourage, eventual, numerary, chafed, overwatched, uvular, rasorial, articular, geotropic, etc. There will be no visitation, tower, rose, king, or moon. And the last one that I'll read is a longer poem, which is why I've only got 5 poems in the set. Actually, a lot of the book has to do with my parents. I read one poem about my late father-in-law, but my own parents are a focus of much of the book, and actually a lot of it has to do with events around and following the death of my father in 2018. By his own wishes, he was cremated, his body was cremated. And I was responsible for the ashes, the disposition of the ashes. So this poem, just to set you up, it's about 8 minutes long. It's in 6 sections. Add one father to earth. 1. Shelved where his shoes had been, his unrested ashes weighted in a black lidded box, in stout plastic, held close in his vacant clothes closet above the hamper, where I threw the garments he wore to ride in his final ambulance. After 16 weeks, I carried them through the Florida city. At the airport, they were scanned with a smile. Just rode with us past a weed-ridden car dealership. No one but me remembers the small town lunch spot in that place. We scavenged our first nothing open Sunday sandwiches there. Our one last trip past that obliterated memory, on the way to the church of dwindling recollections. Church for 30 years before my parents' migration toward lawn egrets and ditches for stormwater. Returned back from paradise to the church where my father troweled my mother's remains 7 years before, where we then committed his. So much human grit. 17 people stooped to the earth. Now it settles in earth, uncoffined, unmarked, fluid as matter through matter. A remnant preserved for my desk in a modest marble urn before me on a blue October with its stubborn city greenness of trees. 2. He lifted his free right arm from beneath his hospital blanket. Forced speechless by the apparatus propelling his lungs, he opened his hand toward us. His fingers curved one by one in a cascade against his palm, little finger rippling toward index finger. He did this 3 times. We saw it, the gentle opening and graceful closing of his grip. We didn't understand. He then spread his palm to face us, moved it side to side, in towards and out away from him. This we understood because as children we learned to wave when it was time to go from someone. But first, he spread and curled his fingers to grasp no one's offered hand. I saw this and I blanked. When I first held the density of his remains, I realized what he had asked of us. I knew it only then. 3. 16 weeks stillness on his closet shelf, the the closet in service to their bedroom. Waking one morning, he told my mother he couldn't do it anymore, could no longer lift her, walk her, feed her. A nursing home opened to her before sundown. 16 weeks, sacked in resolute plastic, necked by a dog tag in a snap brim box in a floral yellow shopping bag of sympathy. 4. Famished family lost without lunch in our new little town. Sunday noon in 1963, Lord's Day, we're closed. Nothing in the cupboard, the movers left us. We'd hauled our trek from corn country, Indiana to Tobacco Shed, Massachusetts, the best asparagus earth on earth. The Gronostolski onion truck, prodigious Polish name, festooned wide in paint, fading even then. Stan the vegetable man, whose beacon sign blazoned a man figured, yes, of vegetables. Those decaying stalwarts still held the roadside 50 years later, wayposts for homecomers. But brand new then, still lunchless, we roamed Route 9 in the Red Rambler, 3 cranky boys, 2 disoriented parents. Who could tell how this little lunch place arose like a vision? The Spruce Hill Restaurant, a brigadoon of sandwiches. That eatery of the first day of the rest of our lives. At some erased moment between then and now, the slope-roofed lunchbox poked its sides out, glassed its front to sell autos, failed quickly. There are its stubborn, barren windows, shameless stains, opportunist weeds, souvenir I remember and reject. Something of my father goes for his final ride past our first meal. And I want to challenge someone, find the strength to take this forsaken hulk, render it to atoms, lay it down. 5. Grit, the color of faint after feathers, in an equable porcelain bowl set near dugout earth. A car radio edges the church sidewalk beyond the garden. The thought of entertainment by subwoofer serenade frets me, and there is a lot of ash. 4 sons, 2 wives, 2 girlfriends, grandson, each settles a ceremonial scoopful in the empty space. Still, there is much ash. I call to the witnesses, make impromptu community event of this. 4 cousins, 2 husbands put their hands to the work. Sister-in-laws, father and stepmother take it up, each in stillness with their minds arcing toward the trowel, its mass. Christ, there is so much ash left. I squat, take the bowl at the lip, empty his persisting remains directly into the gape, like cups of flour into a mixing bowl. I don't want that image, but maybe it is that image. Add 1 father to earth, cover and let stand overnight. Let stand permanently. 6. Let stand permanently. That tablespoon worth of him saved before passage through the airport, before passing the first lunch ruin, before the memorial garden. Saved for a desktop urn, veined in lightning bolts of rust red, with patches of near white, like elderly skin. Marble monument cool against my palm, fingers wrapped like tendrils around the jar. Fragment or fractal of the gravestone he refused with adamance. He would not be left as a site of pilgrimage, a chiseled name filled over time with lichen, a site of contrite visits, first rare, then none. Instead, he is home with me, while my home persists. Before me in the shifting late October sun, I close my eyes against the waxing daylight, open them upon his urn again in the temporary darkness. And thank you very much, everyone. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. That was very moving. and brought back a lot of memories to me, I'm sure. You can hear me, can you not? Okay. Our second reader tonight is Elizabeth Chiles Shelburne, who grew up reading, writing, and shooting in East Tennessee. I can identify with that. Only I was in Minnesota. After graduating from Amherst College, she became a writer and a staff editor at The Atlantic. Her nonfiction has been published in The Atlantic, Boston Globe, Dead Darlings, and Global Post, among others. Her essay on how killing a deer made her a feminist, was published in Click, When We Knew We Were Feminists. Her debut novel, Holding On to Nothing, was a gold medal winner in the Independent Publisher Book Awards, an Okra pick by Southern Independent Booksellers Association, and was featured in NPR's All Things Considered, the Boston Globe, the Millions, the Week, and the New York Post. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Elizabeth Shelburne.
Thank you so much, Dorothy, and thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here tonight as part of Chapter and Verse, and I want to thank the Jamaica Plum Poets for inviting me. It's also such a thrill to read with Gail and David tonight. Poetry was my first love, so listening to their work is just really brings me a lot of joy. David, your poems were beautiful. Thank you. My debut novel, Holding On to Nothing, is set in East Tennessee, where I grew up. The book tells the story of Lucy Kilgore, who has her bags packed, ready to leave her hometown when a drunken mistake one night tethers her to the town and to the notorious Jep the tailor, who becomes the father of her child and sets in motion a story about love, liquor, music, sorrow, and redemption. Imagine, if you will, an Appalachian ballad come to life. That's how I usually describe it to people. I thought I'd say a few words about the origin of the novel before I read two small selections. As I said, I grew up in East Tennessee, part of my childhood on a farm where we had a small allotment of what we called the sin crop, which is tobacco, if you don't know. My dad was a hangout, a shingle lawyer who sometimes got paid in dental services or moonshine, which we kept in our pantry in a wild turkey bottle that he'd written an ER on. So it was wilder turkey. So that was always an option if you were a kid. When I was in college, this story actually started because I was home from college helping my parents out. They'd bought a log cabin and they were taking it apart to move it over to our farm, because you can take them apart just like Lincoln logs and put them back together. And I was out taking pictures of the cabin by myself one day, and this black as night Camaro drove by once, and then it drove by twice, and then it drove by a third time and finally stopped. And this already drunk at 2 p.m, 40-something-year-old, I was 19 at the time, got out and walked over, and he said, "That's a fine looking vehicle and you're a fine looking woman." And being raised Southern, I said, "Thanks," and politely sort of continued the conversation for longer than I should have and would have now. But he offered that he had a barn at his place I could take some pictures of, and I did decline that and mentioned that my dad was a lawyer in town, and he took off pretty quickly after that. But before he did, he had reason to worry, I think. Before he did, he said that his name was Jephthah, and it was a name I just could not get out of my head for years. And I really wondered what someone like him would have been like in his 20s, already drinking, making bad decisions, guns around. And around the same time, Lucy came to me, the other protagonist of my book, with a line about Lucy had a smile that made people feel safe, even if she'd never felt that way. And I knew if I could get these two together, that there would be a story there. So I had characters, and I knew that those two would never have left their town, their small town in Tennessee. Their families were from there, their friends were from there. And, which I think anyone who's from a small town would say there's lots of good and bad about that. The good is you're surrounded by people who know you and have known you all your life. And the bad is you're surrounded by people who know you and have known you all your life. So I had this setting. So I wanted to just say a little bit about that. And I thought I'd just read y'all just the first scene when they first cross paths in the book. Jephthah is a mandolin player in a bluegrass band. He's just playing his first gig at a new bar called Judy's Bar. And he's just seen that Lucy, who is sort of the unrequited love of his life, is a waitress there. And he has just played the worst set of his life with his band and is going back up on stage. The next 45 minutes belonged to Jephthah in a way that no other moment in his life had. He was on fire, ready to take on the devil at any minute. His band was the first to notice. They kept punning solos his way on 3 different songs that had never had solos before. The crowd quieted to listen, roaring to cheer him on when his solos ended. But Jephthah only had eyes for his mandolin and for Lucy. He stumbled only once in his playing, when he looked up from a complex part and didn't spot her anywhere in the crowd. His hands momentarily ceased all movement until he saw the bathroom door open and Lucy stood in the hall watching him play for a minute. The light glowed off her hair and the sheen of sweat on her nose. He picked right up playing again, joy coursing through him and out his fingertips. When their set ended, Jephthah bounded off the stage, mandolin in hand, pushing through the crowd until he stood in front of Lucy, his body bouncing with the energy of a set well played. "You were amazing," she said, her smile huge, well past polite. Jephthah could tell she meant it. He had to grip his mandolin with both hands to keep from crushing her to him, sweaty t-shirt and all. "You don't have to say that. I'm not saying it because I have to. I'm saying it because it's true." Jephthah had joined the band because Cody had promised him they'd rarely practice and there might be groupies. No practice and the possibility of sex, Jephthah was in. But he'd never expected the girl in thrall to be the one he'd been in love with since he was 16. No one had ever looked at him like Lucy did then, like she was a kid spying the newest Christmas toy for the first time. He flashed to his mother's face, searching for one memory where she looked at him like he was something special. None surfaced. Rather, her face was lined with the disappointments of having married a man who couldn't stop being mean long enough to direct a little bit of his paycheck toward the upbringing of his kids, rather than to the alcohol and drugs and gas for the many affairs he conducted across the county. His mother had never had the time or the inclination to shower admiration on her children. If Jephthah or his siblings had demonstrated any talents, they were more likely to be squashed as a dangerous rebellion against the Taylor norm. For generations, his family had worked as hard as they could at doing as little as possible outside of making moonshine, stealing cars, and collecting as much social security as they could con the government into giving them. Jephthah's grandfather had been arrested more times than anyone could count, and his father only slightly less. If there was a break-in or a bar fight or a drunken accident on the road, everyone in town expected a Taylor to be involved. So far, no Taylor had killed a person, but it wasn't for lack of trying. His father had been so drunk the day he'd tried to kill Jephthah's grandfather that all 6 shots he'd fired had missed the old man, who stood stock still, as if getting shot at happened every day. When his dad had thrown the gun away in disgust, the old man shook his head and walked back into the house to finish his drink. Jephthah's mom had tried for the first few years to make the future something other than an unedited rewrite of the past. However, by the time Jephthah was born, her spirit had been worn to a nub and her skin to an ever-present mottled green sheen in trying to fight against her husband. And she'd come to learn that putting her head down and getting through each day was best for everyone. It was no way to be happy, but it was a sure way to survive. The only thing she wouldn't concede was church. There was no sin so great that church on Sunday couldn't atone for it. Even though the church ladies like Mrs. Slocum were nice to him, Jephthah had long understood it was only because it was their Christian duty to do so. He'd been 10 when he snuck out of the sanctuary one Sunday and down into the fellowship hall where the church ladies were preparing the after-service snack. There, hidden under a card table covered in a floral paper tablecloth, eating a stolen donut, he had heard Mrs. Gillum whisper to Mrs. Slocum, "Them Taylors now, they's as direct a rebuttal of that evolution nonsense as anything Pastor Terrence says. He is mean as a snake like his dad and his dad before him, and bless her heart, she's dumb as a bag of rocks. Them kids don't seem no better. Ain't a one of them evolving." Mrs. Slocum had hushed her quickly, but not before Jephthah's cheeks flared with the heat of shame. He was suddenly aware that other families weren't like his. He understood the looks and whispered conversations when his dad walked into a store, recognized that near weekly visits from the sheriff weren't the norm for other families, and saw with sudden and painful clarity why the kids laughed even harder than usual when he stumbled over a word in reading. Everything changed in that moment. No matter what he did, he'd always be a tailor. He'd become a man then, huddled under that card table. He sometimes wished it had made him a different kind of one, but if he was going to be a tailor no matter what he did, he'd quickly decided he might as well enjoy the reputation. He'd stopped trying in school, dropped out as soon as he could, and started getting his own visits from the sheriff. He'd gone to church with his mom until he was 17, but when she died of lung cancer that summer, he'd looked around during the funeral service and realized that no one much cared if he came to church anymore, nor did they much want him there. It was much easier to hate the sin and love the sinner when he wasn't standing among you every week. For the last 5 years, he'd worked only when he had to, drunk as much as he could afford, and taken advantage of the loose morals of any number of girls named Chastity and Honor. He reckoned he'd been as happy as any tailor could expect to be. But now, drinking in the look on Lucy's face that made him remember his name was Jephthah, not just Taylor, his sweaty fingers cradling the neck of his mandolin in just the way his hand wanted to be holding the back of her neck, he understood, for the first time in his life, the value of giving a damn. So that's Jephthah. He is a kind of lovable loser of the worst sort. And really, he and Lucy get together that evening. They keep drinking, keep flirting, end up having sex in the back of Jephthah's car. It's the culmination of everything Jephthah's ever wanted in his life, pretty much the best night of his life, and it is the worst night of Lucy's life. So the book picks up, the book goes back and forth between Jephthah and Lucy's perspectives, and picks up a few weeks later. I'll read a little bit from Lucy's voice. Damn, 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 Lucy said, punctuating the words with elbow-jarring smacks of her palm against the rim of the porcelain tub on which she sat. She stared at the tidy collection of plastic wands arrayed on the sink's edge and watched as one after another, the line indicating the pregnancy test had worked, grew a faint twin, both lines pink and parallel in their certainty that her life, never so great to start with, was now officially ruined. Until the fourth test turned pink, she hoped the positives were the result of clear blues gone clear wrong. As wrong as the decision, if one could call it that, she'd made 3 weeks ago to have sex with Jephthah Taylor. Whiskey had obliterated every objection she ordinarily would have had, scouring out the institutional memory everyone in town was born with where it concerned the Taylors. She'd forgotten all about the rumors of the girls he'd slept with, how he dropped out of school, how he had no parents, not that she could hold that one against him, not having any herself, and spent his days drunk and wild. She even for a moment forgot that it had been his dad whom everyone first suspected when her parents had been killed by a drunk driver when she was 13. Even after the trucker, so drunk he would maintain for years afterwards that it wasn't me, officer, it was my pig, came forward, no one quite believed that Jimmy Taylor wasn't the real culprit. But that night, drunk on whiskey and full of an addled sort of awe at how good Jephthah's mandolin playing was, every single one of those reasons had escaped her mind. She'd spent the next 3 weeks alternately berating herself and praying, hoping contrition and begging would be enough to spare her the consequences of not only sleeping with Jephthah Taylor, but doing it without a condom. Staring at the test in front of her, she knew with certainty that God, that old peeping Tom, figured any girl who had sex in the back seat of a car deserved to get pregnant. Even he could see that the sex back there just wasn't that great. Tears sprung up in Lucy's eyes as she stared at the test. She shook her head so violently that they blurred into nothing. Her plan of getting out, of leaving this town, of doing something more with her life, even if it was moving an hour away to slowly but surely work her way toward a degree, one class at a time, was now, if not impossible, much, much harder. Since she'd lost her parents, she'd been plugging away at their dream for her, anticipating nothing but checking off the boxes they'd set up as defenses against their only daughter living the life they'd hoped to escape themselves. Graduate high school, move out of the small town, go to college. Some days she wanted those things too. And certainly the whole town wanted them for her. When her mom and dad had died, she'd become a ward of the town in a sense. She'd been chosen as the one who would leave, a vessel for whatever dreams of escape that flitted through their own minds from time to time, and then were dismissed as hopeless without ever really being considered. But not so for Lucy. They watched out for her, made sure she had what she needed to succeed in school, raised money for her when she needed it. Even in those moments when Lucy thought of giving up and accepting that she'd live here all her life, someone was there pushing her on. Late at night, though, when Lucy was alone and brave enough to admit it, what she imagined finding in Knoxville was not herself or an education or what she wanted to do with her life. It was finding a family. The education part of it was an afterthought, merely the means to a happy end. Going to Knoxville meant finding a family and becoming whole again. Trying to live that dream had kept her centered. She kept moving forward, working hard, and caring about something so that she wouldn't become another careless slut, boozing it up so she had nothing because she had nothing better. That dream of Knoxville, of the family she'd find there, was the thing that kept her going. The reason why the church ladies could say, without resorting to their Christian duty, that she'd done real well considering. She was stayed on the path her parents and the town had made for her, like a tractor running the same grooves year after year. But now, looking down at the pink lines in front of her, she felt a deep pit in her stomach as she imagined the looks on the faces of those who'd helped her. The utter disappointment and devastation when she told them she'd gotten drunk and destroyed their dreams. Even worse, though, was the dissolution of her own dream. She thought of the boxes packed in a corner of the living room, the ones neatly labeled with their contents and marked Knoxville on the top. Boxes that would need to be unpacked and probably never packed again. Her future would be here now, in this small town, her name forever etched beside Jephthah's, even if they never spoke again. The thing that scared her most about that looming fact was not the loss of the future she'd planned, her disappointment or her anger at herself for being so stupid. Those were feelings she knew and could understand. What scared her most was that slippery, joyful fear. Pregnant by Jephthah Taylor was bad, undeniably bad, but there, muddled in with the horror of carrying the town drunk's kid, was a flicker of delight. It welled up like oil suddenly seeping out of a long abandoned well. This baby would be her family. Nothing pieced together, nothing cobbled. Her blood, her genes, her body would make this baby. And no matter what happened, they would be a family. It wasn't what her parents, the town, or she had ever dreamed of. But Lucy suddenly knew it didn't matter. None of that did. Some part of her wanted this. So that's Lucy. And what I really wanted to explore with just those two characters was the world that I'd grown up in, was the one I'd grown up hearing stories about. I sometimes think with small town fiction or with Southern fiction, sometimes it's, you get the really, really, really bad where it's all sort of meth and murder and opioids. And then sometimes there's the opposite extreme that's kind of the Southern living Vaseline on the screen effect. And I wanted to write about the middle, which is, I think, where most people live, and where people really generally are neither all good or all bad, and that people meet the circumstances they're living in with warmth and humor and faith and music, lots and lots of music. There is in this book a lot of music. It's named after a Dolly Parton song. There's a lot of bluegrass, some country, lots of old Appalachian tales like Shady Grove and Constant Sorrow. Because this is a poets gathering, I thought I'd read not my poetry because no one wants to read that, but the poetry of an old song that appears in the book, Constant Sorrow, just at the very end. And I'll just read the last two verses of that. It's fare you well to a native country, the places I have loved so well, for I have seen all kinds of trouble. In this cruel world, no tongue can tell. Maybe your friends think I'm a stranger. My face you'll never see no more. But there is one promise that is given. I'll meet you on God's golden shore. I love sort of the old songs, the old ballads like that, because I think they really persist in our culture because they tell those stories about people who are really trying to make the best of the bad hand that they've been given. And people like Jephthah and Lucy, and sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't. So I'll let you read the book to decide if you what you think is the case for them. But that was sort of my goal with this book, was to write sort of that Appalachian ballad and bring that to life in the way and give some life to the people that I'd known growing up. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I can hear that I am a maid of constant sorrow in my mind right now. And you don't have to grow up in the South to grow up in a town like that.
No, you do not. I hear that from a lot of people.
I knew those families. I knew those guys.
Yep. Yeah. Sometimes my favorite is when I talk to a book group and they say, "Did you know my uncle? Did you?"
Did you know my boyfriend?
Exactly. Maybe.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, the music was just a little different up there, a little more polka, but really.
Yep, same stories.
That's great. So congratulations on your book.
Thank you, everyone.
And finally, tonight, we have a wonderful local poet whom we all know and love. I've known Gail for a long, long time. And I'm so happy to see that she has now a new and selected poems just published called Land's End, which is the last of her 8 collections, which blows me away. The others are Forbidden City, Figures in a Landscape, Zeppo's First Wife, which I love, winner of the Massachusetts Book Prize and finalist for the LA Times Book Prize, and They Can't Take That Away From Me, finalist for the National Book Award. She is the founding director of the Blacksmith House Poetry Series in Cambridge, Mass., and on the writing committee of the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown. She's recently taught as a visiting professor in Boston University's MFA program. Let us all give nice waves to Gail Mazur.
Thank you. Thank you. I just suddenly changed my mind about what I was going to read. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I wanted to, I didn't want to start with, but now I want to start with Zeppo's First Wife, which
Thank you.
I haven't read for a long time. And the Zeppo I'm referring to is Zeppo Marx, who was always considered the least of the Marx brothers. He might have been the smartest, actually. But it turns out that Zeppo's first wife was married to some kind of distant cousin of my grandfather's. And, nobody talked about it. And then at some point, I actually went to the Lincoln Center Theater Library to find what I could about this woman, Marion Benda. And it became a very confusing story because there were 2 starlets the same age who had both changed their names to Marion Benda. So I never knew if whether the Zeppo's wife that I was talking about was the one that was purportedly related to us. But this starts, there's an epigraph that's a typical conversation with my mother. She says to me, that's her father's, one of Doc's cousins married one of those 5 brothers, the funny ones. Who were they? The Marx brothers? Yes, them, the youngest. I don't remember the name. Zeppo. Yes, Zeppo. They got divorced. And the other epigraph is from Groucho Marx. Why should I care about posterity? What's posterity ever done for me? And that was my only American-born grandparent, and he actually grew up in Maine. He refers to Zeppo. He married a cousin, or actually my grandfather's half-brother's cousin. No one here remembers Zeppo's first wife, related to my great half-uncles, Phil and Jesse, high-living lawyers in New York, bachelor brothers, a little unsavory. They dated showgirls. When Jesse invested in a Broadway play, he whispered to me he owned a piece of Fanny. Their father, Simon, my great-grandfather, owned a haberdashery in Rockland, Maine. Whose cousin was it married Zeppo, the blank, born Herbert, smarmy amidst his dervish brothers, the baby whose mother put him in the act when Gummo joined the army? Bystander at his brother's rioting subversions, their chaos in a cauldron, the ingenue, the romantic lead, never one of the brilliant enfants terribles. Straight man, no puns, no double entendre, more victim than Marxian tormentor. People who really knew them said he was the funniest. But once on tour in Omaha, when Groucho had appendicitis, Zeppo painted the grease paint mustache above his lip, roughed up his slick black hair, donned black rimmed glasses, and brought the house down. The audience never knew, no one knew, Zeppo could be as unzipped as his zany, unloved older brother. Was that his zenith or his nadir? He never had that chance again. He was so good, Groucho was known to say, it made me get better quicker. Groucho, with his zero-sum philosophy, a win for anyone could only be a cataclysmic loss for him. So in the end, Adolf, the angelic demon harpist, Leonard the gambler, and T.S. Eliot's pen pal, Julius Groucho, kept the act alive, leering into unfunny age with a callow crooner always filling the fourth pair of shoes. And Zeppo, he was an inventor. He created a clamping device our Air Force used in the atomic raid on Hiroshima. Then he teamed with Gummo, real Americans reinventing themselves, two also-rans. They partnered up, began a talent agency, and thrived. And the first wife, my state of Maine, twice unremembered, distant half-cousin, nonce removed, whose name I find this morning on the web, Marion Benda. Footnote to a footnote. She's gone, of course, as the brothers are, through the zodiacal lights beyond stardom and failure, beyond his family's history and ours of raves and flops, replaced, forgotten, not missed. Only the hand that touched the hand, my mother would say dismissively, but surely something more, something happier. Her life not so unlike yours or mine or Zeppo's. Then he never got top billing, no one's idea of the zeitgeist of the jazz age, except that night his brother's biographer uncovered. He came in first, he was the rage. He lived in an audience's delirious laughter, lived not quite himself in the roar of its applause. And then he left the stage. This poem is called To the Charles River. My mother and father both grew up in Dorchester. So, and they never lived outside of Massachusetts. So the Charles River was a big part of our lives. We lived in a little house in the suburbs on the Charles. My grandfather on the other side, on my father's side, had 7 brothers who all lived within 2 neighborhoods of each other in Dorchester. And I shared that grandfather with another poet who's here tonight, Jennifer. Or, yeah, grandfather, except she's younger, as you all know. To the Charles River. Because you flowed through my childhood, because summers I swam freely in your currents, because you froze every winter, metamorphosed to a glazed floor for skating, because I believed you were the first landing place for Leif Erikson, although the World Book claimed otherwise. Leif named his new discovery Woodland and Land of Flat Stones, because you had trees and many flat stones, gray skipping stones. Leif's men found wild grapes and salmon there, and my father fished from your shore, catching perch and pickerel, and found them delicious to fry in spite of their little bones. Because on the Day of Atonement, my grandfather walked from Dorchester to empty his pockets into you, casting off lint and crumbs for the year's sins, his good shoes steeped in your waters, because your dark green trees promised to protect us, because twice I nearly drowned in you, and a neighbor's child did drown, small body washed up on your snarled bank. Because my love and I canoed through your toxic years when you'd become reeking and filthy, only mutant fish and water rats swam in you. He'd say there's no great city without a river. And because a governor, that's Dukakis, because a governor determined you were worth saving and cleaned you up and made you swimmable again and lively with mallards, grackles, American coots, in our warming world nearly paradisial, because an ocean says eternity and a river says home. Because, dear familiar, I believe I haven't stepped into the same river twice, for other waters always flow into you, and I am always a different person. Because this chilly October, I find devil pods tangled among your river grasses, tough, grotesque little seed pods that look like bats or demons that will always live and thrive in you and in me. I'm a former migraine sufferer. I suffered from migraines for 50 years and they're gone with the wind now. This poem is an ode to them. Dear migraine, you're the shadow lurking in me, and the lunatic light waiting in that shadow. Ghostwriter of my half-life, intentions ambush I can't prepare for. Ruthless whammy, you have me ogling a blinding sun, my right eye naked, even with both lids closed. Glowering sun, unerring navigator around this darkened room. You're my laser probe. I'm your unwilling wavelength. I can never transcend your modus operandi. I've given up trying to outsmart you, and the new thinking says I didn't invent you. Whatever you were to me, I've outgrown. I don't need you, but your tenacity embodied, tightening my skull, my temple, like plastic wrap. Many times I've traveled to a dry climate that wouldn't pander to you, as if the great map of America's deserts held the key to a pain-free future, but you were an encroaching line in the sand. Then you were the sand. We spent the best years of my life intertwined. Wherever I land, you entrap me in the unraveled faces of panhandlers, their features, my features, you, little death I won't stop for, little death luring me across your footbridge to the other side, oblivion's anodyne. Soon, I don't know where or when, we'll dance ache together on my life's fragments, one part abandoned, the other abundance. My husband, Michael, spent very formative years of his life, of his young life in Italy, learning to be an artist outside of an institution. And it was many years later that I went to Italy with him for the first time. And I had a little Dover book of Italian poems. Remember those little Dover paperbacks that cost $1? And one of them was this poem by Michelangelo, who wrote hundreds and hundreds of sonnets. And it was written in utter despair to his friend, the artist Giovanni da Pistoia, when he was painting the vault of the Sistine Chapel, 1509. The translation was awful in the Dover book, and that's how I came to translate it. I had Mike read it to me over and over again in Italian. To Giovanni da Pistoia, when the author was painting the vault of the Sistine Chapel. I've already grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a cat in Lombardy or anywhere else where the stagnant water's poison. My stomach squashed under my chin, my beard's pointing at heaven, my brain's crushed in a casket, my breast twists like a harpy's. My brush above me all the time dribbles paint on my face, makes a fine floor for droppings. My haunches are grinding into my guts. My poor ass strains to work as a counterweight. Every gesture I make is blind and aimless. My skin hangs loose below me. My spine's all knotted from folding over itself. I'm bent taut as a Syrian bow. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy, perfidious tripe. Anyone shoots badly through a crooked blowpipe. My painting is dead. The Sistine Chapel. My painting is dead. Defend it for me, Giovanni. Protect my honor. I am not in the right place. I am not a painter. I find that an oddly comforting poem. And I spent many years I've spent in Provincetown being on the writing committee of the Fine Arts Work Center, which chooses artists and writers who have not yet had worldly success. I mean, that's one of the major criterions. Like, no writer who has a book would get a fellowship to the Work Center. So you can imagine as the years went on that there were more and more applicants, and it was a bigger and bigger job. This poem is really about the kind of incredible, cantankerous, great poet Alan Dugan, who lived in Truro and served on the writing committee. And he actually was quite surly and quiet, and seemed to think that no one ever agreed with him. When sometimes I'd have to say, Dugan, we all agreed with you. It's called Shade. And he was also a chain smoker of Gauloise cigarettes, which ultimately did him in. Shade for Alan Dugan, 1923 to 2003. A cold April day, 5 black ducks huddled, shivering on the bay, and coming to life, gardens on Commercial Street we were all indifferent to. 8 writers in a sort of circle, arguing, ardent, a committee living on argument, fierce, dismissive, overeager, youthful manuscripts on fire with the possibilities for poetry, as if we knew the stakes, as if we could determine the future of American literature in that sunny room. Those meetings, gripping, intoxicating, then heaven, all of us with passionate positions and adamant or uncertain, arguing the world. And there sat our grumbly Dugan, but was he ours or anyone's? In a chair apart, the least voluble among us, hunkered down, muttering, decades past posturing, if he'd ever postured, insistent, contrary, yet the least excitable among us, as we all wrangled for something we were sure was ours to shape. Gone for good, the Gauloise, gone for good, the six-packs. In his lap, page after page of illegible notations on the yellow legal pad he'd scribbled on all winter, and kept to himself, but he was there. He told me once he'd always lost those battles. I never actually saw him fight them. He'd read his notes and sit enclosed and silent, except to growl, deadpan, everyone's writing poems about Georgia O'Keeffe, or They all think they know Coltrane. Or Frida Kahlo again. The implication, no one but Dugan understood those three, and dead they'd become drained conventions, degraded by callow enthusiasms. I don't know if he's a poseur, he said of one poem, or if he just doesn't know what the fuck he's doing. No exclamation points in Dugan, only judgments thudding, resounding in the fierce room from the old poet in his distant Brooklyn boyhood was by his parents nicknamed Spud. Spud, that boy impossible now for us to imagine. How, I didn't know any word for it. How unlikely. That's Bishop. But today, more than a decade after his death, taking a stab at sorting my papers, I find in a box some of Dugan's notes written on the back of a beat up manila folder, lines that stop me. That long ago ephemeral Provincetown day brought back tellingly in words I struggle to decipher and transcribe. His handwriting, illegible chicken or rooster, ballpoint scratches, incongruously similar to Bishop's hand on early drafts of One Art. Only 85, a long way to 100, he writes, and the darkness grew closer and darker, and he tried to see through it to the other side. Fearless and undefeated, he died on his deathbed, fought his sins to a draw. I'm sure that's what this says. Then a space, then one more word above a list I've written of sandwiches for the committee's takeout lunch. Shade. And in my tidy Palmer method, our choices, 2 lobster rolls, 1 Greek salad, 4 fried sole sandwich, squid stew, 3 lemonades, coleslaw, fries, Coke, etc., etc. Thinking of his bitter poems we so relish, I hear the same unashamed, intransigent voice in those oddly triumphant lines, musical, destined for the wastebasket, scrawled when he was nearly 80, half lame, half blind. What makes me think copying them here? There is no music in hell. Who believes in hell? Who believes in heaven? I think I'll read one more poem. It's called Young Apple Tree, and it was originally written to dedicate for the dedication of a apple tree, a sapling, I guess you'd call it, that was being planted to honor Florence Ladd, who had been director of the Bunting Institute. I was asked to do this, and I didn't know what to write, because it was like being asked to write an ode to her, and it was overwhelming. I mean, especially since she was alive. But I went into the studio and said to Mike, say something to me about a young apple tree. And he said, they know to seek balance as they grow. And I went for a walk and I came home and I had the poem. I never write a poem quickly, but he somehow chose just the point that I needed. Young apple tree, December. What you want for it, what you'd want for a child, that she take hold, that her roots find home in stony winter soil, that she takes seasons in stride, seasons that shape and reshape her, that like a dancer's, her limbs grow pliant, graceful, and surprising, that she know in her branchings to seek balance, that she know when to flower, when to wait for the returns, that she turn to a giving sun, that she know to share fruit as it ripens, that what's lost to her will be replaced, that early summer afternoons, a full blossoming tree, she cast lacy shadows, that change not frighten her, rather change meet her embrace, that remembering her small history, she find her place in an orchard, that she be her own orchard, that she outlast you, that she prepare for the hungry world, the fallen world, the loony world, something shapely, useful, new, delicious. Thank you, and thank you for my fellow readers. I really enjoyed it, even though I was already nervous.
We never suspect that you're nervous, Gail. And that's a lovely poem about the apple tree and to Florence Ladd, whom I remember very, very well.
Yeah, yeah.
Lovely lady. And thank you all to all our readers tonight. This has been a wonderful reading and very moving reading. And now if you would like to unmute yourselves, you may chat, you may berate me for my mistakes, or you could actually make announcements if you have any. Holly,
I'll
would you
start
like
off by applauding my